It's State of the Water, and we are continuing our conversation with the candidates. Today, we have a candidate that's running to be governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. It's State of the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville, and we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back and welcome on this beautiful Sunday here in Hampton Roads, Virginia. Thank you for joining us here on State of the Water on WNSB Blazing Hot 91 on the campus of Norfolk State University. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville, and we are so elated to continue our conversation with the candidates who are running for statewide office here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Today, we're going to have a discussion and a conversation with one of the gubernatorial candidates who's running to be governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that's Senator Jennifer McClellan. We'll have her on in just a few moments, but I also like to thank everyone, all of you that donated to the WNSB Blazing Hot 91 Membership Drive 2021. Without you, we could not do what we're doing here today. We thank all of you for your donations. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting. To all of our staff, the university, and all of our stakeholders, alumni, and all that are abroad. Thank you so much for your support. WNSB is a great place where we not only play great music, but we also have great programs, great discussions, and we have opportunities for you to call in at any time because this is a radio station that embraces the community. 757-823-9110, 757-823-9110. As we continue our conversations during this time period, we want you to call in if you have any questions, if you have any comments, let us know. Because for the month of April, May, and June, we've been continuing and starting our conversation with the candidates who are running for statewide office for the Democratic primary. Now, I want to make a distinction here. This is for the Democratic primary, which will be held on June 8th. June 8th, which is Tuesday. That is election day for the primary. The reason why we're not having a conversation with the candidates for the primary for the Republican Party is because they've already had their convention. It was a convention which was basically held by the delegates. They did voting by different places within the state, and they came up with their ranked choice, and they came up with their candidates. So that's the reason why we haven't had a conversation on the Republican side, not because we're not partisan. We want to give you all the information out there so that you can make the best decision possible, but it's because they did not have a primary. But we will be welcoming all candidates who are running in the general election. But I want to give you a few dates to keep in mind. Keep in mind that right now early voting is started April 23rd. It's already started. You can vote in person. You can vote in person, early voting, also called absentee voting, with absolutely no excuse you have to give. You can go to your registrar office in your county, and you can go there. All locations are open Monday through Friday. Monday through Friday, during the times of the registrar's office in your locality, you can go vote early. You can get out of the way, and the last day to vote in person early is June 5th. June 5th. This is for the primary leading up to the general election, which is in November. And also, if you want to do a mail-in ballot, you can order your mail-in ballot all the way up to May 28th. You can order your mail-in ballot all the way up to May 28th. And every locality will have 2 Saturdays leading up to the June 8th election where you can go vote. You can go vote on Saturday, May 29th, and also June 5th. That's May 29th and June 5th. Those are 2 Saturdays you can go and vote in person at your registrar's office. And the polls open on voting day, which is Tuesday, June 8, 2021, from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. Again, that's 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. As long as you're in line by 7 p.m., you will be able to vote. You will be able to vote. This last legislative session, the General Assembly, led by the Democrats, expanded voting, expanded access to the ballot. Various Senate bills, 1157, various House bills, 1298, and another House bill. These expanded access to the ballot box and also eliminated some of the voter suppression that's out there. Keep in mind, your right to vote, in the words of the late John Lewis, is the most powerful non-violent weapon that we have in our democracy. It is the most powerful weapon that we have because you have the ability, the listener, you have the ability to vote for the representatives that you want to represent you in not just statewide office, not just in D.C., but also on the local level, school board, city council, and also constitutional offices such as Commonwealth's attorney, tax assessor, treasurer, and the like. You have that power. You also have the power to vote up and down any type of laws, any type of provisions, constitutional provisions that are on the ballot and ordinances that are placed on the local ballot. You have the power to say, this is how I want to be governed, or this is how I don't want to be governed. All you have to do is simply register to vote. And once you register to vote, then you have the power in your hands. And that's a very powerful tool because, these United States of America, we live here. We help to build this country as African Americans with our labor, with our sweat, with our tears, with our blood, with our children, with our hands, with our innovations, our ingenuity. And we know that things aren't perfect, but we have the power to change the narrative. We have the power to change the course of time if we simply get out there and vote. That's the way to make your voice heard. Everybody can't be on the radio. Everybody can't be on television. A lot of people don't like being on social media. Some people don't like being out in the forefront. But everybody can have a powerful voice by voting. That's your powerful voice, by voting. We have a lot of these, during the pandemic, we've done a lot of these Zoom meetings and the like. And sometimes when it's time to be heard, we have to say, unmute yourself. Well, when you go vote, I want you to unmute yourself. That's your opportunity to go into your ballot box. That's your opportunity to go into your voting booth and unmute yourself and go and vote. How powerful is that? Tremendously powerful. And again, we've had candidates, we've had representatives in the Hampton Roads area talk about things that have been done, that they've done for the Commonwealth. As a matter of fact, we've had our representatives who are alumni of Norfolk State University, Delegate Cliff Hayes, Delegate Candy King, and also Delegate Lamont Bagby, who is the chair of the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus. They were here in April and May discussing the very powerful legislation that they helped to pass. We also had other delegates across the area, across here, Southampton Roads. We had Delegate Alex Askew and several others. And then after our conversation with the candidate, we're going to go toward the Senate, and we're going to have our senators that represent us here in Southampton Roads, the Hampton Roads area, who are also alums of Norfolk State University, that will talk about the important legislation and things that are coming up. But before that, we are going to conclude our conversation with the candidates on next Sunday with the Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax and former Governor Terry McAuliffe, who are both vying for the Democratic nomination to represent you in the general election and to be governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Again, it's a powerful show, powerful conversations, and you know that we ask the hard questions because you deserve to know how individuals will represent you here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And in just a few moments, we're going to have a conversation with Senator Jennifer McClellan. She wasn't able to join us live because of her schedule, but we were able to record a phenomenal discussion with her where she talks about her passion, she talks about her purpose, and why she not only wants to be governor, but why she chose politics. I mean, it was a very intriguing discussion about, her time in college and how her, looking at her parents and understanding the struggles that they went through and her desire to not have anyone's else children, including hers, go through any of what we've started to see. But in the second half hour, we want you to stay tuned because we have a special guest and we're going to take a slight break from the conversation with the candidates, and we're going to talk about the Tulsa race massacre. Just this past week on Capitol Hill, we had testimony by 3 survivors of the Black Wall Street massacre in 1921. Can you believe that, DJ Scandalous? Can you believe that? 1921. 107-year-old who was 7 at the time, and her brother who's 100 years old, they witnessed what took place there. She testified how she still hears the screams. She still sees the dead black bodies in the street. She still talks about seeing black men being shot down for no reason for 2 days by a white mob who went in and destroyed. She still smells the destruction of the houses and the businesses that were burned to the ground. And then she still remembers how they were being kept under gun, secluded, while they picked the bodies up and buried them in a mass grave and dared anybody to talk about it. Scandalous, she talked about how history may have forgotten, but she never did. And I think about that sometimes. I think about how none of us know the mind of God. Nobody knows the plan of God. But just maybe, he allowed Ms. Viola Fletcher and her brother to stay alive over 100 years, in part, just so they can give their testimony in the United States Capitol during the pandemic, just so they could see, just so we could hear what took place. Who knows? But it's a powerful discussion that we're going to have, and we're going to have that in our second half hour with another alum, Lisa Godley, who is an Emmy Award-winning producer regarding a documentary that's going to be produced and air on PBS and our affiliate here, WHRV in the Hampton Roads area. But again, stay tuned for the second half hour for that powerful discussion. But right now, we're going to listen to my discussion with Senator Jennifer McClellan and her journey and desire to be governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Right now, we have Senator Jennifer McClellan, who wants to be your next governor here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Senator McClellan, welcome to Stay the Water.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. Well, again, we're wrapping up our conversation with the candidates here in the months of April, May, and next month in June before the primary election on June 8th. And we're talking with all of the candidates who want to run to represent our people of the Commonwealth in statewide office. And you're running to be governor. And tell us a little bit why you would like to run to be the governor of the people of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Well, it's really the same reason I ran for the House of Delegates in 2005 and have been in the legislature ever since. Why I got interested in government and politics to begin with as a kid, and that, listening to my parents tell stories of life growing up, in the segregated South during the Depression, I came to understand that government at its best is a force for solving problems, for helping people, responding to crisis, but at its worst is a force that oppresses some, ignores others for the benefit of a few. So as we are navigating COVID and the health pandemic, a reckoning with 400 years of racial injustice and a growing loss of faith among Virginians in government's ability to solve problems, I want to restore that faith and rebuild our economy, our healthcare, our economic safety net, in a way that leaves nobody behind.
Absolutely. It's so much that you said in that brief statement that has really come to the forefront. We know that 2020 was a year like no other.
Yes.
We could start with the once in a century pandemic, and we're praying it is once in a century. Also with the social justice movement, the social unrest, with the unfortunate killing of many, including George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd. And then also we had a very tensions, but also involved election. And we found a lot of bright spots in that time period. Tell us, what about 2020 helped to galvanize, your campaign and really push it to the forefront?
It was, I think, a realization that I'm tired of fighting the same fight that my parents, my grandparents, and my grandparents fought. And, being on lockdown with my children, my daughter who just turned 6, my son who's 10.
Oh, wow.
And looking at them and saying, I can't leave these fights to you. And I can't look you in the eye and say I did everything I could to keep you from fighting these fights unless I step up at this moment and run for governor and rebuild Virginia in a way that addresses inequity that's always been there and doesn't just create a seat at the table for people and perspectives that have been excluded, but take that table out into our communities and reach out to Virginians in every corner of every age, of every background, and say, we have more in common than not, and we need to work together to build a stronger, more united, more equitable Virginia.
Absolutely. And that's a very good point that you bring out. We do have more in common than we have apart. It's sometimes it's just that one little thing that separates us. In politics we call it wedge issues, right? But it seems like your campaign, you want to bring the people of the Commonwealth together. What are three of the platforms? Three of the agenda items on your platform that you want to work toward to bring the people of the Commonwealth together if you're elected to be governor?
Yeah, so it starts with stabilizing and rebuilding and our economic recovery, recognizing it wasn't a one-size-fits-all crisis, so it's not a one-size-fits-all recovery, but it has to be one that doesn't pit business against workers because they need each other. It's a symbiotic relationship. So we've got to rebuild in a way that brings them together and addresses both of their needs. That rebuilds our healthcare system in a way that recognizes, look, we weren't ready for this crisis, and
right.
We've got to rebuild the healthcare system so that we're not only prepared for the next one, but we're finally addressing disparities in access to both health insurance and health coverage and disparities in treatment and outcomes. And the key to both is going to be our education system, rebuilding our education system from birth to career in a way that front loads and recognizes the equity gap begins at birth and addresses both inequity, but make sure we are teaching our children the skills they need to be adults who get both their first job and their last job.
Absolutely. And
providing universal child care as a foundation to both that education and economic recovery.
You also mentioned that, you started this journey in 2005. And I think that's important to know that to our audience that you just haven't arrived in public policy. You've been here and you've been working for these areas that they're so passionate and close to your heart. I mean, I hear the passion in your voice when you talked about your children and looking them in the eyes and talking about your parents and what they've gone through and how you want to continue to fight that fight, but also end it, right? What are some of the areas that you've championed when you ran for the House of Delegates and currently serving as senator?
So first, let me, I actually started this fight in 1990 as a college student when I first set foot on campus as a freshman, and I joined the Young Democrats and have been working as a party activist and leader and community activist and leader ever since. And I really want your students to hear that, because they're not the leaders of tomorrow, they're the leaders of today, and that's how I got my start.
Wow.
But as a legislator, 14 years I was in the minority party, but I have been able to get more than 300 bills passed. Everything from the Voting Rights Act of Virginia, the first Voting Rights Act in the South, the Clean Economy Act that shifts us to 100% clean energy standard and begins to break our dependence on fossil fuels while addressing climate change and building jobs. The Reproductive Health Protection Act makes us the first state in the South to proactively protect access to reproductive health care. Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, we're the first state in the South to extend worker protections to domestic workers that many of us take for granted, like minimum wage and anti-discrimination laws. So these are just a few. I mean, on criminal justice reform, on access to health care, access to affordable housing, breaking the school-to-prison pipeline, improving our school system, fighting domestic and sexual violence, reforming our child marriage laws. Like, these are all things I started working on in 2006 in my first session. And when it was hard, when we were at 32 Democrats, when it wasn't popular, and when the attention and the media weren't covering those issues, I was digging in and laying the groundwork for generational progress that we've made just since 2020.
And you mentioned that's very important for our college students to hear, because we saw in 2020, and I witnessed it. I've talked with the youth, and I don't like to call them youth. They are youth, but they are leaders of the future, right? They are leaders
of today.
Leaders of today. I like that. And it's good to hear, that story that you just articulated, because many times our young people feel as if they don't have a voice, as if their opinions don't matter. Now, of course, with follow up your ideas with counsel. There is safety in a multitude of counsel and wisdom from those of us who have gone through it. But it's important for them to know that their voice matters. And if you become governor, what would you do to ensure that the youth of today, the youth leaders of today and of tomorrow, would have a voice in your administration?
Well, first, I'd show up and listen, and I want to have an administration that reflects the full diversity of the Commonwealth, including by age. And both as governor, but also as party leader, really encouraging our students by showing up at every grade, including college, to talk to them and have roundtables and invite them to participate. I think we can't just create a seat at the table, but take the policymaking table out into our communities. And so, and remind them. So in 2019, and after the scandals of 2019, I was in a roundtable with a group of multi-generational Black women, just talking about how that February impacted us. And I remember a young college student who was about to graduate, who didn't say anything. And I looked at her and I said, Alicia, we need to hear from you. And so I kind of interrupted and said, y'all, I want to hear what Alicia has to say. And what she said was a gut punch, because she said that the first election she ever paid attention to as a child was Barack Obama.
Oh, wow.
The first election she ever voted in was the election of Donald Trump. And that everybody else at the table had seen progress in their lives, but she and her generation had only seen regression. And that for many of them, they thought, why bother? They're going to come out with crushing debt. The earth is going to die. Like, why bother? And I looked at her and I said, Alicia, if you don't bother, we are lost. And I invited her to come and work for me in my Senate office. She now works on my campaign. And again, I got my start organizing college students in the 1993 gubernatorial election. And so I will make sure that reaching out to college students for not only this election, but how we are going to rebuild this recovery in a way that includes them, because they've got to be engaged and they've got to bother, or else we're lost.
Absolutely. That story is really the story of so many other individuals, not just our young leaders of today, but also many of our citizens who have lived for years and decades that saw and have the same story. They haven't seen progress, but only regression. In your first 100 days, the people of the Commonwealth are looking for a leader who's going to basically put action on the table for them. In your first 100 days as governor, what would you do in those first 100 days to ensure that the people needs are met?
So first, before I'm inaugurated, during the transition, I will build a state government, again, fully reflective of the full diversity of the Commonwealth, not just based on who's donated to my campaign, but who has the skills and the perspectives that we need to be involved. I will make sure that the first thing I get to do is introduce amendments to the state budget, because Governor Northam will introduce the outgoing. My budget will reflect my priorities, which is rebuilding our education system. So fully funding our K-12 needs, universal child care, stabilizing and growing the child care system. For higher ed, making sure that our higher ed institutions have more state funding, because they haven't gotten a lot, and especially our HBCUs have been underfunded for years.
Absolutely. Strengthening
relationships between HBCUs and emerging markets and jobs like clean energy. And then rebuilding our healthcare safety nets and making sure that your access to testing or vaccines, if we're still in the pandemic, or just everyday care, doesn't depend on where you live or your access to transportation or do you have health insurance, but really expanding that coverage gap.
Absolutely. Senator, it's been a pleasure talking with you about your campaign, your platform, but more importantly, hearing your passion for the purpose that you have laid out to run and be our next governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Before you go, tell us where our listeners, if they want to learn more about you, your campaign, if they want to volunteer or even donate, where can they go to learn more about you?
Absolutely. You can do all of that on my website at jennifermcclellan.com. On social media, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Jen with 2 N's, McClellan.com, and on Facebook at SenatorJenniferMcClellan.com. But again, the website tells you all the ways to find me. And we will be back in the Hampton Roads area. Our last debate is June 1st at Christopher Newport. So tune in, but please join this movement and just get out and vote and change the world.
You heard it here. State Senator Jennifer McClellan, running to be the next governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Thank you so much for joining us on Stay at the Water. Good luck to you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Again, we're continuing this conversation with the candidates for statewide office. So that was Senator Jennifer McClellan discussing her desire and her passion of running for office for governor of the Commonwealth. And we're going to conclude our discussion with the candidates on next week with Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax and former Governor Terry McCullough. That's next week, and we're going to conclude that before we go to our Get Out the Vote show on June 5th, actually June 6th, which is going to be that Sunday, right, Scandalous? June 6th. But we want you to stay tuned, because in the second half hour, we're going to have a discussion about the 100-year anniversary of the worst Tulsa race riot and massacre in nation's history. So stay tuned and join us for the next half hour. Absolutely. So we're going to have a special guest on for that time period. And that special guest is going to be our very own Lisa Godley, who is an alum here at Norfolk State University and who is an Emmy Award-winning producer. You've heard her voice many times here in Hampton Roads. You've heard her across the board, and she's going to come and we're going to talk about this documentary that's definitely coming up. So right now, I'd like to welcome to the air Lisa Godley. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us here on State of the Water.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you very fine. You're great. Absolutely.
It's wonderful.
So, we actually wanted to take a break from our conversations with the candidate that we've been having for April, May, and June for statewide office because there's a very important anniversary, and I hate to even call it an anniversary, that we have coming up next week, May 31st through June 1st. This is just like American history, Lisa. American history is we've heard the good, but there's a lot of bad that took place. A lot of people's lives were lost to create what we know as America. A lot of genocide took place. A lot of theft took place. A lot of things took place that we don't like to talk about, and that's not in the history books. And there's something that took place in Tulsa, May 31st through June 1st, 1921. And that was the Tulsa Race Massacre of what we know of Black Wall Street, where a white mob of residents set fire to hundreds of Black-owned businesses and homes in what's called the Greenwood District of Tulsa, Oklahoma, killing 300 Black residents and leaving over 10,000 Black residents homeless. And there's a new documentary that's coming out to discuss this, and it's part of PBS, which you are part of, our PBS affiliate here in Hampton Roads, WHRO, WHRV, and we're really excited to discuss this part of history. Tell us a little bit about this documentary and what's coming up.
Well, Eric, the documentary tells the story, and it's actually heartbreaking. I got to see a screening. I didn't get to see the entire thing, but I did get to see a significant portion of it earlier in the week, and it's heartbreaking to see what these folks went through, and actually what some in the area are still going through, just because of the witnesses, the people that were victims of what happened in 1921. Yes, some of them are still alive, and to hear them talk about what they went through, it's just heartbreaking, to say the least.
Oh my goodness. And when you say they're still going through it, I want people to understand that this tragedy that we have here in 1921, and it is a tragedy, one of the worst recorded racial violence in American history. Over 100 years ago, not one person was punished for the crimes that were committed. And history textbooks often don't even make any mention of it at all. And still, a lot of Americans, even in the African American community, we know about this, right? Like a lot of our history, is word of mouth. We pass it down because a lot of history is suppressed. But a lot in white America and a lot of Americans who are not African American don't know about this history. So one thing that your documentary does, it points out and really uncovers a lot of this.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And as I said, watching it, it's just, I was finding out things that I didn't know about, what was going on. And it was heartbreaking to hear a lot of the things that had happened. I mean, some of those folks escaped with just the clothes on their back. Those that did escape, when the I don't want to even call it a riot, because it was originally, they used to call it a riot, the Tulsa riot, but it was a massacre.
It was a massacre, that's right.
I'm glad that they've changed the name to call it what it was. And, you hear the stories about how people came into people's homes, with torches and set their curtains on fire so their houses would go up quicker. And it's so heartbreaking to hear that people were tortured like that, the way they were. And to hear some of the victims who are still alive, 107, 106, 100 years old, talk about what happened, in their households. It's like, oh my goodness. And I honestly and truly believe God has kept these people alive so that they could tell the story and that people could hear what actually happened to them out of their own mouths.
Lisa, I mentioned earlier in the first half hour of the segment where I talked about and said that we would actually explore this part of our history. I made the statement that we don't know the mind of God. We don't know the plan of God. That we don't know what God will, what he will do now or in the future. But just maybe, as you said, just maybe, he preserved these three individuals who are over 100 years old to give their real life account. Nothing passed down, but what they saw, what they witnessed would take place. I mean, how powerful is that testimony?
Oh, absolutely. You hear the arguments about reparations and things like that, and I'm listening to these people talk, and I say, if anybody deserves reparations, these people do. They have lived this long and have lived with this each and every day of their lives.
Absolutely, but not just Miss Viola Fletcher. Her name is Viola Fletcher, and for our listeners, I want you to go and look up Viola Fletcher testimony on Capitol Hill. Viola Fletcher's testimony on Capitol Hill. She talked about the day the white mob came to Greenwood Avenue in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when she was 7 years old. And Lisa, for 107, right? We've had some people in our family live way well into their 90s and so forth, and they were crisp. I mean, their mind was sharp. My grandmother's mind was as sharp as a tack. We would call her for phone numbers of our relatives because we didn't know what they were or couldn't remember them. But Miss Fletcher, she sat there, and I watched the testimony. She sat there, so attentive, so powerful, so clear, concise, descriptive, with such clarity and conviction, and described that day as if it was just yesterday. But it was over 100. It was over 100 years ago for her. And I'm going to read an excerpt from the NPR segment in which she actually testified. In the NPR documents, it says that during her emotional testimony on Capitol Hill, she said, "I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home." She said, "I see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street." She said, "I still smell smoke and see fire. I see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead." She said, "I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day." She says, "Our country may forget this history, but I cannot."
Wow. That's so powerful. For you to talk about those airplanes, I had never heard that before until I watched this portion of the documentary talking about airplanes flying over, dropping things. And I was like, oh my goodness. I know these folks felt like they were in a war zone.
Absolutely.
American citizens in the middle of a war zone.
Right. And it was a war on them.
On them.
And it really all boiled down to, well, first of all, I want to talk about the other two survivors, Ms. Viola Fletcher and two other survivors. They were on Capitol Hill this past week, who were survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, that talked about their experiences. Her younger brother, Hughes Van Ellis, and Miss Leslie Benningfield Randall testified before a House Judiciary Subcommittee on Wednesday, nearly 100 years to the day of the massacre, where some historians say that as many as 300 black people were killed, and another 10,000 left homeless, and the Greenwood district was destroyed by the attack that was launched on May 31st and lasted until June 1st of 1921. Lisa, when you talked about the airplanes, and you kind of brought something, just a vision that I saw. We didn't have the sophistication of airplanes as we have now. So you can imagine the loud buzzing sound and the low flying planes that were there, and how that would scare and terrify a young girl and young children.
Absolutely. Just very incredibly frightening. It had to be. I mean, I can't imagine anything else. It's just the thing, part of the documentary, another thing that stood out to me, they were talking about where some of the bodies had been dumped, following this, and they're looking at bodies of water there now, and looking at certain areas where they want to, exhume these bodies and try to find out, if they have gunshots, because a lot of the people that were buried, weren't identified.
Right. Exactly.
Dump them. And it's so sad. It's just really so sad. It's just the way blacks have been treated in this country throughout history. It's very sad. It's very heartbreaking.
Absolutely. You're listening to WNSB Blazing Hot 91. This is Save the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville. You're tuned in now as we discuss with Lisa Godley, alumna of Norfolk State University and an Emmy Award-winning producer here in the Hampton Roads area at WHRO WHRV, where she produces Another View with Barbara Ham Lee. We're talking about the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, a PBS documentary that will discuss and explore this history, which will air on May 31st as well. Lisa, I was talking with our producer here, Save the Water, Scandalous, and he said 1921. He said the world had just come out of the first, what we know as the first modern day pandemic of the flu pandemic, also known as the Spanish flu, but we call it the flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920. And then in 1918, we had just come out of World War I. So you add a pandemic that kills 1/3 of the world population. On top of that, a world war that killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And now this community, just removed from the First World War, just removed from the flu pandemic of 1918, 1920, and in 1 year later, they're enduring the genocide, the destruction of their community that they worked years and years to build. Imagine the trauma.
Exactly, and not just any community. These folks were prospering. And, of course, there was some jealousy there, too, because they were prospering, and they were doing incredibly well. They had their own businesses. I mean, they really did everything within their community.
Yes. As a matter of fact, I mean, let's talk about this, because Ms. Viola Fletcher's brother, Mr. Hughes Van Ellis, is a World War II veteran, and he wore the U.S. Army hat at the hearing. And then he talks about how we were shown that in the United States, not all men were equal under the law. We were shown that when black voices called out for justice, no one cared. Now, this is someone who saw the decimation of his family and businesses in the area, his neighbors, and still served his country proudly in World War II. I mean, how beautiful is that? And I like to say, I've come to the conclusion that there's nothing more American than being African American. We're people that have given so much.
Oh, absolutely.
And received back so little. But we still continue to give and continue to love. I mean, that's being a true American. When people talk about patriotism, look at what African Americans have contributed to this country and received back in return.
Oh, absolutely.
It pales in comparison. But
it absolutely fails.
But Lisa, I want to talk about, you mentioned the jealousy factor. I want to talk about, why this massacre happened in the first place. And the documentary kind of goes into it a little bit.
Yeah, these stories kind of, it's almost like there's a blueprint for these stories. And I was talking to my daughters about this, and it's almost like a blueprint. A young black man is accused of doing something to, a white female, and then it, blows up into this mob that he's arrested, and this mob wants to drag him out of jail. But the men of Greenwood were, they said no. They said, we'll come up to the courthouse and we'll protect, this young man in this courthouse. And, and the mob, I want to say, which was, 4 times as many, maybe more than that. I think there were like 1,500 of them that came out. I think it was like 75 black men and like 1,500 white men that came out to quote unquote seek justice in their minds.
Yeah.
So, so the black men had no choice but to retreat, to their community.
Absolutely.
But oh my gosh, 3 days.
Yes. Yes.
Fires and rioting and looting.
It's as a matter of fact, what Lisa is referring to, the Tulsa race massacre began during the Memorial Day weekend after a 19-year-old named Dick Rowland, a black shoe shiner, was accused of assaulting Sarah Page, the 17-year-old white elevator operator in the nearby Drexel building. And as you stated, they decided to take vengeance out, not just on a young man, but on the black community. Now, as you said, it seems like there's a blueprint. Well, let's go back to the U.S. Supreme Court case about the Scottsboro boys. The Scottsboro boys were 9 African-American teenagers from 12 to 19 accused in Alabama of raping 2 white women in 1931. In this particular case, this landmark case set legal cases from this incident dealt with racism and also the right to a fair trial. And again, it's like you said, the blueprint. Oh, somebody raped a white woman or assaulted a white woman. In many cases, if not all, but in many cases, this was found not to be true.
Yep.
And it was something that you could say happened, and they were believed to have happened. And these black men were then subjected to justice at the hand of white mobs. And many times they were lynched, hung from trees. And where Billie Holiday talks about strange fruit hanging from trees. And their bodies were set on fire. Their bodies were desecrated. They were beaten, sometimes the most horrific things. And for those of our listeners, for those of you who have never seen a photo of someone lynched, Lisa, a lot of times in those photos, you see white groups that are gathered in their Sunday's best, standing around, taking a picture, men with their children around a dead body, black body hanging from a tree with no fair trial, no justice, all because somebody said they did something and immediately they received the death penalty.
Vigilante justice. I've seen pictures where people are having what look to be picnics outside, around a tree. It's just nice. Absolutely unbelievable. So, again, with this documentary, it's going to uncover a lot of the history of not just what took place in Tulsa on that day, but it's also going to talk about the life of Greenwood. Tell us a little bit about what existed in Greenwood. Oh, my goodness. Schools, library, movie theater, banks. Oh, my goodness. The list goes on and on. They had everything they needed, grocery stores. They had everything they needed to survive and thrive in Greenwood.
And when we talk about integration, I know a lot of African-American businessmen and many looking back talk about how integration was really one of the worst things to happen to African-American businesses because they were not given the support that white businesses were given, when it came time to open things up. In other words, a lot of money flowed out of the community and never came back. So, now when we talk about Tulsa, when we talk about that particular business district, African Americans in those areas, and keep in mind, this existed in a lot of areas across our country, right? So if you go to any major city or any area where African Americans were, you had black doctors that lived there that had their practice there. You had black dentists that lived there, had their practice. You had black lawyers. You had black barbershops, beauty shops. You had grocery stores where it was owned by the African Americans. You had insurance companies that were owned by African Americans. As a matter of fact, the neighborhood we grew up in, my father, our family owned the child care center for 21 years in our community. The law firm down the street where my father did business with the lawyer, the barbershop we went to, the gas station, the insurance company, the funeral home, all that was black owned.
Absolutely.
My
dad worked for a black owned insurance company when I was a little girl. I remember.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it's Norfolk had Church Street. I remember doing a piece on Roanoke and the community there. Every area had one. You had to have one because you weren't allowed anywhere else.
Exactly.
So you had to have your own community that had your own stores and the different things like that because, it was just, they wanted to keep you in your area.
Right.
But then when you became like Greenwood, prosperous and started doing well, then the jealousy set in. So.
And there's another story in our history of Rosewood in Florida like this. Matter of fact, that was a movie that was created to, a dramatization about it as well. But there are other stories out there where cities were set on fire, communities were set on fire, and people were killed all around, like you said, the same story, right? The same blueprint. A black man assaulted a white woman.
The thing that comes to my mind always when I hear that, of course, is Emmett Till. And I'm like, man, it's just heartbreaking for me, Eric. Every time I hear these stories, and, I'm so glad the history is coming out, and people who don't know the stories are learning about the stories, but at the same time, and as much as I want them told, because they are a part of history, even though some of them are the ugly part of history, I'm glad that they're being told, but it's heartbreaking to hear them. It is truly heartbreaking. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And, in those districts, as you said, jealousy set in. One of the unfounded criticisms of those that oppose African-American upward mobility is that, you need to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and stop asking for a handout. When it's actually the reverse. We're not asking for a handout, we're asking for justice and our hand up for what has already been earned and shed for blood and the like in the past and even now so. And also keep in mind that everybody, you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you don't have any boots, you don't have any straps, right? So, but Lisa, when you're able to do that as they did in Greenwood, then jealousy sets in, and there is an orchestrated effort to destroy African American upward mobility, economic upward mobility, education upward mobility, and in order to live the American dream.
That's right, and all we've ever asked for is equality. We've never asked for more than to equal the playing field. That's all we've ever asked for is equality. I remember hearing somebody say, and I wish I could remember who said it, but he said, to privilege, he said, equality equals loss. And I was like, wow, that's pretty profound.
Wow.
That's pretty profound.
But, we've also shifted toward, we talk about equality, but I talk about equity. I talk about equity because equity tells me that if you need to get up a little more effort to get up to the point where everybody else is, then you need a little bit more than someone else who already has. And again, it's not about a hand out, but rather a hand up if we're talking about equity. In other words, when I talk with some of the candidates, I ask them about if they have the power to in their position. African Americans, politicians come to us to march, to advocate, to get out there and take the brunt of the issue. But when it comes time to craft the deal, when it comes time to draft the business plan, when it comes time to hand out contracts to those individuals who have companies that can do the work, we're nowhere to be found. Everybody forgets about the African American community then. So not so much equality, but equity. If we're putting in skin, if we're putting skin in the game, then we should also be able to be at the table when it's time for us to reap some of the benefits. So,
I agree 100%.
I want to point out what Tulsa is today. In the testimony that was given by Miss Leslie Benefield Randall, who testified over a video conference, she says the effects of the massacre are still felt today. She said, quote, "My opportunities were taken from me and my community." Ms. Randall said that Black Tulsa is messed up today. They didn't rebuild it. It's empty. It's a ghetto. Who is 106 years old. She said she not only survived the massacre, but she has also now survived 100 years of painful memories. But by the grace of God, she's still here. She survived to tell that story. And hopefully, she says, we will hear all and listen while they're still here. Lisa, when we talk about the effects of laws and public policy, talks about the effects of slavery, talk about the effects of Jim Crow, it just wasn't back then, but it's now. And if you look at a lot of our communities, Martin Luther King boulevards and our black communities that were prospering at one time, they look like ghettos now, just as, they're empty, just as Miss Randall said.
She was absolutely right. Yeah, you could just pick one, one particular area, just about any city in the country, and that's what you'll find.
Absolutely.
So, sad but true.
Absolutely. So, Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. And before you go, just tell our audience when they can tune in to watch the documentary on PBS and any information that you want us to know.
All right. The name of the documentary is Tulsa, the Fire and the Forgotten, and it will air on May 31st at 9 o'clock on PBS. You won't want to miss this. This is a powerful documentary. It tells the story and then some, and then some. So you'll see what's happening now in the legislature, and you'll get a chance to find out what's going on now as well as what happened in the past. So it's an outstanding documentary, and it's one that I highly recommend you take time to watch.
And Lisa, another thing I appreciate what the documentary is going to do, it also chronicles present day public efforts to memorialize the Tulsa Race Massacre and other racial violence around the country, and how black and white communities also view it, because persons don't realize that it was actually legislation that was shot down by the Oklahoma legislature to include this history in history books.
Exactly. I laughed when I saw that. I just shook my head. I said, you know what? Things have got to change. They've just got to change. When I saw that, I just shook my head. I really did.
And Lisa, this is our time to changing the narrative one story at a time, telling the complete history of America. Thank you so much for joining us. You can see this documentary on May 31st, Tulsa, the Fire and the Forgotten, that examines the Tulsa Race Massacre 100 years later. Thank you, Lisa, so much for joining us on Stay in the Water.
Thank you so much.
Well, that ends our hour. Scandalous, it seems like every time we get into a great discussion, time just flies by. But that's why we're here every single Sunday at 1 o'clock to talk about these important issues that are important to the community and to bring policymakers, movers and shakers to you to ask those issues and deal with them that are important to you. Don't forget, again, watch the documentary, Tulsa, the Fire and the Forgotten, on May 31st. And tune in next Sunday as we conclude our conversations with the candidates who are running to represent you in statewide office, as we talk with the Lieutenant Governor, Justin Fairfax, and former Governor Terry McClellan. This is Stay the Water. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Claville. Enjoy this Sunday, and we'll see you next week.